I want to welcome you all to Medicine Grand Rounds. First, I want to thank Drs. Becky Barron and Joe Lascalzo for their support in having this Grand Rounds. And I want to also thank all of you for coming this morning. So as you know, the climate crisis is a public health emergency. And as a result, it's really critical that we as physicians and other health professionals understand the associated health consequences, as well as the need for urgent action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We are really honored today to have two internationally recognized experts in these areas who will be speaking about the threats posed by climate change, but also opportunities for action. Our hope is that their talks will be a springboard for action here at the Brigham. So just for a moment before we get started, I want to mention that immediately after this session, Paul DeLaRippa, Greg Fury, and I are going to host a short session to discuss local opportunities for action. So we hope some of you will join us for that. And for people who are interested but can't come then, we have a sign-up sheet outside. So now to introduce our speakers, and I'm only mentioning some of their many accomplishments so we leave time for them to speak. The first speaker will be Dr. Howie Frumkin. He's a physician and epidemiologist who's just now finishing a 2-year stint as head of the Our Planet, Our Health initiative at the Wellcome Trust in London, and he's an emeritus professor at the University of Washington School of Public Health. He was the director of the National Center for Environmental Health and the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry at the CDC, where he launched that agency's climate and health program. His research interests include health aspects of climate change, the built environment, energy policy, nature contact, and sustainability. He's authored 9 books and over 250 scientific articles, including just this week in the journal and Perspective that you all should read on natural gas and its risks to health and the environment. Our second speaker, and then they will be speaking together, is Bill McGibbon. He's an environmentalist and author who serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College. He founded 350.org, which is the first worldwide grassroots climate change movement, whose actions included spearheading resistance to the Keystone Pipeline, as well as launching the fossil fuel divestment movement. He's written over a dozen books, including a 1989 book, The End of Nature, which was considered the first book for a general audience on climate change. He's also published numerous articles, including ones in The New Yorker, The New York Times, National Geographic, Rolling Stone, The Atlantic, among many others. So I just want to thank you both very much for being here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Howie. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and good morning, everybody. Thanks to the entire team here that's pulling together this effort and calling attention to the climate crisis. Special thanks to Bill. It's really an honor to be sharing a podium with you, and all I can say is that when I grow up, I hope I can write like you write. Well, Bill and I are going to split our time as follows. I'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, reviewing some of the medical aspects of climate change. Bill will speak for a few minutes after that. Then we'll team up and get a little conversational, first with each other and then with all of you, and that should take us just about to the end of the hour. So if you have questions or comments, do nurture them, and we'll have time for them toward the end of the hour. This is my requisite disclosure, no conflicts of interest that I'm aware of. I'm going to make 9 points. The first point is that climate change threatens health, and it threatens health in many ways. You probably know the outline of the story. Carbon dioxide levels and levels of other greenhouse gases have been rising over recent years. CO2 beginning at about 280 parts per million pre-industrially, now up to well over 400. And as the result of the accumulation of greenhouse gases and other processes such as deforestation, we've triggered Earth system changes, including in the upper panel, rising temperature, in the lower panel, rising sea levels, more chaotic weather, more extremes, both droughts and floods. And those Earth system changes, in turn, have led to a series of health impacts, as you see here. Now, we won't have time today to go through and inventory all of these in detail, but I'll show you some sources in just a few minutes to which you can refer if you'd like to learn more detail. Quickly running through these. The direct effects of heat are familiar, and I'll actually talk about those in just a minute. Severe weather events cause not only acute injuries and fatalities, but a very large burden of long-lasting mental health disruptions. Air pollution is an interesting example. Not only does air pollution get worse under situations of warmer weather as ozone formation is driven, but some of the very same processes that give rise to air pollution also give rise to climate change. That's burning stuff. So one day when people look back and they say with incredulity, "You mean they burn stuff to get energy?" they will be referring both to climate change and to air pollution. Allergies become triggered under climate change because, in kind of a divine joke on all of us, plants like ragweed and poison ivy thrive under conditions of warm weather and higher CO2 levels. Chemical transport is accelerated in the environment, meaning that many chemical exposures are intensified. There's a large body of evidence on infectious diseases, both vector-borne diseases and waterborne diseases, becoming worse under climate change. Threats to the water and food supply, about which more in just a minute. The mental health consequences are only now becoming recognized, with a lot of attention in the last year as a consequence of youth activism to the phenomenon of eco-anxiety. But there's actually a very multi-layered and interesting set of mental health consequences. And finally, as cities become waterlogged, as storms occur, as agricultural output in some regions drop, people need to move. And the implications for migration and/or conflict accompanying migration are potentially some of the biggest health impacts of climate change. So a very, very broad set of pathways leading from climate change to health. The second point is that some of those ways are simple and straightforward, or at least they seem that way. They actually can be more complicated than they seem, and heat is the best example. All of us in medical school learned the simple consequences of heat, which are shown here. And if you've ever worked the Boston Marathon, you've probably seen one or two or even all four of these things. And if you've run the Boston Marathon, you may have experienced one or two of these things. But heat also has additional consequences. When heat waves occur, tens of thousands of deaths can follow, generally from cardiovascular and pulmonary disease. In the 2003 European heat wave, 70,000 deaths. In the 2010 Russian heat wave, 54,000 deaths. And in South Asia, over most of the recent hot seasons, untold numbers of deaths in the thousands. But heat is even more complicated than that. Heat seems to predispose people to violence and crime, as crime rates rise when the weather gets hotter. Heat may predispose people to self-harm. There's some evidence that suicide rates rise with hot weather. Heat increases the risk of kidney disease, a threat that especially targets workers in low-income countries who toil on high temperatures without adequate rehydration. Heat also increases hospitalization rates for diabetics. In hot weather, it's more difficult to protect food and water from bacterial contamination. The incidence of diarrheal diseases such as Shigella and Campylobacter rises during hot weather. Recently published evidence suggests that premature births increase during hot weather to a clinically significant extent. Heat compromises the quality of sleep. Sleep deprivation, in turn, is a risk factor for inflammatory conditions, metabolic and neuroendocrine abnormalities, and cardiovascular disease. People reduce their physical activity when the weather is too hot. Being more sedentary increases cardiovascular disease risk. Similarly, heat reduces work capacity, to the point that economic output may decline substantially in very hot places, compounding poverty in such places. Workers are affected in another way. Workplace injuries rise during hot weather. So through many, many pathways, ranging from sleep loss to food poisoning to the deepening of poverty, an apparently simple exposure that's climate-related, and that is heat, affects health and well-being in many ways. That's the simple piece. Now, the complex piece is also more complex than it seems, and the example I want to work with you is food. Now, you might think, if you remember from your classes on photosynthesis from back in high school, that CO2 is an input for plants, and plants might actually enjoy conditions of high CO2. Well, in fact, there is a phenomenon called CO2 fertilization. It affects the so-called C3 crops, listed here more than the C4 crops. But empirically, that effect tends to be eclipsed by crazy weather, by higher ozone levels that follow from climate change, by saline intrusion into water tables near coasts. And so empirically, food output generally drops. This is a forecast of agricultural productivity in the year 2050, with red indicating a drop in output. And what you can see is that in some of the most food insecure parts of the world, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, large parts of Latin America, agricultural output is forecast not to increase, but to decrease. Not only that, that doesn't take into account that insect pests that prey on crops thrive under climate conditions. And interestingly, Where that's most striking is in temperate zones, not in tropical zones. So what otherwise might be an improvement in agricultural output in temperate zones may actually be compromised by insect pests. And not only that, I'm going to keep on saying not only that because the story gets more and more layered. Weeds often thrive more than the plants with which they compete, so that weeds become an increasing problem for farmers, and the herbicides that are typically used to fight weeds become less efficacious under high CO2 conditions, suggesting that we may be into higher levels of herbicide contaminants in our crops in future years. And it's not only a matter of agricultural output in quantity terms, but also in quality terms. This is some of the superb work from Sam Myers, who's here at Harvard and here in the audience now, showing that for a number of our staple food crops, the content of zinc, iron, protein, phytates, other nutrients generally decreases, with the happy exception of sorghum. So good news for all of you sorghum eaters out there. But crop productivity down, nutritional value of foods down, and moving from food to fish and livestock through the mechanisms that you see here, productivity generally down as well. So when it comes to beef, for example, lower growth, lower production of milk. In general, a difficult prospect for food. That especially affects people who are food insecure, which shamefully represents about 1 in 8 households in our country. And it doesn't affect us all equally, of course. It's better than 1 in 5 households that are Latino and about 1 in 4 households that are Black. We know what people do when they're food insecure and food prices are rising. The rising food prices being an inevitable consequence of disruptions to the food supply. That is, they tend to eat energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods. They eat the foods that are on the left of this graph, like lard, mayonnaise, margarine, instead of the foods on the right, like lettuce and raspberries and lobster, the kinds of foods that people like you and me tell our patients to eat. That, in turn, is likely to contribute to the burden of non-communicable disease that is a major health issue around the world. So, fourth point, the most vulnerable are the most vulnerable. This almost needs not to be said, but I need to say it. We all saw during Hurricane Katrina that the Black households, the poor households were among the most vulnerable in the city, with less ability to get out of harm's way, with less resilience to rebuild afterwards. But climate change, each of the pathways of climate threats to health targets individual subpopulations in its own way. So, for example, heat especially victimizes the very old and the very young, air pollution, the very old, the very young, those with underlying cardiopulmonary disease. Heat waves target urban residents because of the urban heat island effect. Rising sea levels target those who live in low-lying areas. So for each of these pathways, we need to think about, as the political scientists would say, whose ox is being gored, who's most vulnerable. Fifth point, the situation is truly an emergency. Now, for people like physicians who deal with emergencies every day, this is a term that's at risk of being overused. But we are truly in an emergency situation. And I'm going to show you some pictures of the rapidity of changes in Earth systems. Systems that have been stable for 10,000 years at least, millions of years in some cases, are changing so fast that if we scaled these changes to the span of a human life, we would be talking about major changes in vital signs, in electrolyte levels, and so on over the course of seconds to minutes. Look at the trajectories of these changes, if you will. On the left, you see the extinction rates of vertebrate species rising fast, especially in the last few decades. On the right, you see the collapse of insect populations worldwide. This is in the tens of percents, averaging 40% both in biomass and in species counts over just a few decades. This has been called the insect apocalypse. This is Antarctic sea ice being lost, and look at the accelerating trajectory of loss of Arctic sea ice. This is glacial loss, a real, literally falling off a cliff just in the past couple of decades. This is a picture of weather-related catastrophes. And you can see the meteorologic, hydrologic, and climatologic events color-coded in the key to the right, rapidly increasing. We are approaching tipping points. How quickly we're approaching them, we can't say. But tipping points are system changes that lead to irreversible alterations, in some cases extremely dangerous and self-perpetuating. But the real emergency, in my view, is shown here. Each of these colored lines is a pathway to getting to 1.5 degrees, which is where the scientists tell us we need to be aiming. And they're different because there are different modeled pathways to get to 1.5 degrees. But every one of those pathways to get us to 1.5 degrees successfully requires rapid decreases in our CO2 emissions, down to a 50% point in just over a decade, down to net zero by 2050. This is how fast we need to be acting, and we're going in the opposite direction. We're actually increasing emissions globally up about 2 or 3% in the past year. So this is like a patient whose vital signs are rapidly crashing, and we're actually doing the wrong thing, not the right thing. That's an emergency. What would the right thing look like? It would look like urgent transformative solutions. Now, we know on a global scale where most of our emissions come from. You can draw a pie chart that looks like this. This is global. It's a little different within the U.S., where transportation is relatively a bit bigger and agriculture relatively a bit smaller. But the point is that for each of these sources of CO2 emissions, we know what we need to do. We need to change our electricity generation to make it all renewable, getting off fossil fuels, decarbonizing the economy, and moving to solar, wind, and hydro. We need regenerative agriculture. We need to stop cutting down forests. And that means changes in the food system, producing less meat, eating more plant-forward diets. We need more efficient buildings. We need better transportation systems. And we need a circular economy of manufacturing. These are profound changes, and they're difficult to make. But one of the positive narratives that all of us should be interested in is that they offer health benefits. Let's look at 3 examples: clean energy, well-designed cities, and healthy, sustainable diets. Wouldn't it be great if we could map these to health benefits and make the case for these transformations from the health point of view? Well, these are some of the health benefits we would all like to achieve on a society-wide basis. And the good news is they map. Clean energy yields all of the benefits here. What I've spared you is all of the footnotes on each of these arrows, but we have a solid body of evidence for each of these links. Well-designed cities yield all of the benefits that you see here, and healthy, sustainable diets yield all of the benefits that you see here. So there is a good news story here, that doing what we need to do to rescue our planet and keep our species living and thriving helps our health. Now, the news is grim. I know how you must feel after hearing about the emergency that I laid out. Van Gogh captured it perfectly. But I want to argue that there are reasons for hope. R4H, reason for hope. Number 1, technology is advancing fast. If we are to decarbonize the electric grid, we need much better storage. And battery technology is moving very fast. I said I wouldn't talk about commercial products in my disclosure at the beginning, but the electric car industry is moving fast. If you would like to buy an electric car, there are some very cool selections on the market now. The economics are improving. The graph on the right shows the decline in prices of photovoltaic panels, moving us towards solar energy. This is happening very fast, to the point that solar is cheaper than fossil fuel energy in many parts of the world right now. And if it weren't for the obscene subsidies that the fossil fuel industry enjoys, the price advantage would be almost universal. Policy is maturing. Governments at the national and local level are doing really impressive things. England halted fracking. Luxembourg is making mass transit free. Amsterdam has banned petroleum and diesel vehicles. And good old Brookline, right around the corner, just a couple of weeks ago, banned oil and gas in new buildings. So we are seeing positive policies emerging in many parts of the world. Many nations are making commitments to getting to net zero, including bravo for Bhutan and Suriname that are there already, and many others are planning to get there soon. Many cities are planning to get to net zero. In fact, they're competing with each other. Headline after headline identifies a city that plans to be the first to get to net zero. 4th reason for hope, activism is blossoming. And if any of you have read Falter, Bill's latest book, he cites this as one of the most happy events of the last few years. This offers enormous potential to change the world. 5th reason for hope, the activism works. Public opinion is shifting. More and more Americans actually care about climate change, and this is true around the world as well. And the 6th reason for hope is that the transition is underway. You can see at the top there that renewable energy is rising quite a bit, that 9 countries now generate more than 90% of their electricity from renewables. 2 others are on the way. A number of regions are there. It can be done. And these are not all necessarily sunny places or windy places, but it can be done. Here's a chart of electric vehicle sales. Change is happening. So we can transform this into this by paying attention to the positive trends. And the last thing I want to say, and then turn the podium over to Bill, is that health professionals, all of us, have a key role to play in the needed transition. Now, each of us is many people rolled into one. We are private citizens, we are parents and grandparents, we are clinicians who care for patients, some of us do research, we are institutional leaders, whether at the scale of a single clinic practice or a hospital system, and we are trusted community voices. As a private citizen, your decisions matter. What do you eat? How do you travel? How do you consume goods and energy? I showed you a pie chart a minute ago of where greenhouse gas emissions come from in general. This is a comparable pie chart of where the average American's carbon emissions come from. So this is converted from sectors of the economy to activities in our lives. And in each of these, there are things that each of us can be doing to reduce our carbon footprint and to set an example. And even if you're not inclined to do that, your kids probably want you to. So do think about it. As a clinician, how do you care for and counsel your patients? It's a delicate issue. Some people are uncomfortable doing what feels like advocacy in the clinical setting where non-judgmental and trusting relationships are essential. But this is a question worth considering. As an institutional leader, is your health institution green? And that's a good question to pose here at the Brigham, as everywhere. As a researcher, how do you consider these issues? And finally, as a trusted community voice, do you speak out publicly on climate change? The trusted community voice claim is evidence-based. Physicians are very highly trusted. This is something called the Veracity Index. It's in the UK, but data are similar in the US. Doctors are the highest trusted profession here. I know you'll be shocked that doctors are more trusted than members of the clergy or than journalists or bankers or politicians, but it is true. It's a privilege and a blessing that we have that we need to use. But before you feel too satisfied, doctor, nurses are actually trusted more. So doctors and nurses both have very important voices. So I've made the following 9 points. That climate change is a threat to health. It doesn't affect all of us equally, and we need to think about relative vulnerabilities. The situation truly is emergent, calling for urgent transformative change, but there are some good news stories. The change that we need yields a lot of health benefits. There are positive reasons for hope, and we can make a big difference. For further information about the details of health impacts on climate change, you can look at these sources. These are sort of the national and international review processes. And over to you, Bill.
You've got slides, right? I don't know where they are.
Yeah, let's see. Is it this one? Yeah. Is that you?
Not me.
No, that's not you. Maybe MGR?
That's me.
There you go.
Howard, thank you very much. He's done the heavy lifting. I'm going to underline a few things, and I'm going to show you, I have a long deck of slides of which I'm going to show you literally one image. See if I can get through it here, find it, and see if it will play.
It doesn't play until you...
You know what? I see a button down here that looks like it.
Click this one here, Bill. Take over to slideshow mode here.
You show me. It's worth it. That's... There we go. I took this with my cell phone out the front of a helicopter. We were in Greenland a few months ago. We'd been changing the batteries on one of these instruments that records the recession of glaciers. It takes a minute to get to the good part, so as it plays, let me just tell you the bottom line. Climate change is by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done on this planet, by orders of magnitude. So far, we've increased the temperature of the planet about 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like an enormous amount, but the heat equivalent is. The extra heat we trap because of the coal and gas and oil that we've burned and the carbon we've put in the atmosphere is the heat equivalent each day of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. That's why there's enough heat that 70% of the sea ice in the Arctic is gone. That's why the great ocean currents that keep our climate system working are beginning to slow down. That's why the biggest living structure on Earth, the Great Barrier Reef, is half as living as it was 5 years ago. That ice, this is just the snout of one of these many glaciers in Greenland, is about 120 feet high, so a 12-story building. And we just happened to be going over it when one corner here let go. The waves that it kicked up were 60, 70 feet high, so the pilot was understandably a little eager to get out of there. But I encouraged him to circle once just because there was an eerie and sinister beauty to it. We live on an extremely beautiful planet, and even in its decay, there's great beauty. But also because you just need to get into your mind that something like that is happening every second of every minute of every hour of every day around the planet. And as it does, the sea rises some millimeter, the Earth changes, we move into a new and very dangerous for humans state. So far, as I said, the temperature has increased 1 degree, and that's been enough to wreak enormous change. We can see that change already around us in profound ways. Every dry place on Earth is drier and hotter, and that means increasingly that it's on fire. If you read the New York Times today, you can read the story about how Sydney, one of the richest, most advanced cities in the world, is now wreathed in wildfire smoke for months, to the point where emergency room admissions are through the roof. It's the equivalent of smoking several packs of cigarettes a day. We've raised the temperature 1 degree, but even if we do everything right at this point, the temperature is going to go up about 2 degrees Celsius. There's a lot of lag time, a lot of momentum in these systems. That'll be bad. It won't be a linear doubling of impacts. It'll be an exponential increase because, as Howard said, we're going past a series of tipping points. In fact, there was a landmark paper in Nature 7 days ago demonstrating the fact that tipping point after tipping point, they're now in play, and in play in a big way. So we're probably going to at least go to 2 degrees, but on the path we're on at the moment, the sort of business as usual path, even if people kept the promises they'd made during the Paris Climate Accords, which one country signally is not keeping, the temperature would go up more than 3 degrees Celsius. And if the temperature goes up 3 degrees Celsius, it's pretty clear that we cannot have civilizations of the kind that we are used to having. Just to give you the most obvious reason, the UN estimates that in that scenario, we'd see about 1 billion climate refugees in the course of this century. When you look at the political and economic dislocation, political dislocation really, caused by 1 million refugees streaming into Western Europe, or 1 million refugees arriving on the American border in the South, and then multiply that by 1,000, you get some sense of the chaos that we're now courting. The point that I want to make is, you need to think about this not as a chronic condition, which is how we are used to thinking about political issues in our world. They're things that last our entire lifetime, and we're still arguing about them in one form or another decades on. Our healthcare system and how it should be funded, so on and so forth. This is not like that. This is a progressive and degenerative condition. It's the first truly timed test that human beings have faced. I wrote the first book about this 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we were still issuing warnings about what was going to happen if we didn't change. We didn't change, so now we're issuing bulletins about what is happening, and those bulletins get more dire, not by the decade, by this point, by the month. What that means is that, like any degenerative or progressive condition, it gets harder to deal with over time, not easier. So 30 years ago, a series of modest changes would have helped a good deal. A modest price on carbon, for instance, 30 years ago, would have sent signals into our economy that would have steered the supertanker that is our global economy a few degrees off course, and 30 years later, we would have sailed into a different ocean. But we didn't do that. Instead, we went full speed ahead, accelerating. We have produced more CO2 on this planet in the last 30 years than in all of human history before. Okay? So what that means is that the changes we need to make now are no longer modest. They're difficult. Some of you have seen the Green New Deal that politicians have begun to put forward and have heard it described by our president and others as radical. Well, it's not radical except in the sense that those are the sort of scale of changes one now needs to make because one didn't do what one needed to do originally. The medical analogies are fairly easy. I mean, if you stopped smoking 30 years ago, you probably wouldn't need surgery now for cancer, but if you've reached the point where you need surgery, it doesn't do you much good simply to stop smoking. You still have to go under the knife. So the way to think about this is not as a series of radical changes, it's as a series of necessary changes, necessary to allow a kind of conservative outcome, to allow a planet that still has some ice at the top and the bottom and the odd coral reef in between, that has a temperature regime something like the ones that we're used to dealing with. There is a second way in which this resembles cancer, and that way is that the industries that produced it spent those decades lying about it, and that's why we're in the fix that we're in. We now understand from great investigative reporting, the Los Angeles Times, the Columbia Journalism School, the other important and prestigious kind of journalism outlets, over the last 4 or 5 years, digging through archives and whistleblowers and things, we know that the fossil fuel industry knew all there was to know about climate change in the 1980s and were able to predict with unerring accuracy what the temperature would be in 2019 and what the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere would be. Their scientists were believed within their industry. Exxon began building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming. What they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, they bankrolled this industry an expensive and sweeping campaign of disinformation that was literally based on and run by many of the same people who'd done the same job for the tobacco industry in the years before. They literally hired the same people. When Exxon was in court last month in New York State, or the Attorney General was trying to hold them account for some of this, the lawyer representing them was the same lawyer that had represented Philip Morris on the same issues decades before. What that means, the good news is, as Howard said, a movement has arisen, as arose around public health and tobacco a generation ago. A movement has arisen to try and confront this. It's been building for 10 years, and it's now cresting. 7 million people, most of them young, were out in the streets in September in the largest display of public protest about anything in a long time in this world. It's been wonderful to see organizers like Greta Thunberg get young people really engaged and in the leadership of this work. It's not okay for us to take the biggest problem that the world's ever faced and offload it onto 14-year-olds to solve, okay? It is time for the rest of us to figure out what we're going to do. And that means at this point that our individual actions, though important, are no longer the key thing to be doing. The math has now progressed to the point where we're not going to solve this one Prius at a time, one vegan dinner at a time. If we're going to do it, it's going to be if individuals manage to become slightly less individual and join together in the kind of movements that people in this room have managed to put together over the years to allow our voices to really matter. Some of that is through politics. Think of Washington as one key power center that needs to move. Obviously, we have a chance to move it in the year that comes. Think also, though, of the other key power center in our world, shorthand Wall Street, the financial power that allows the fossil fuel industry to continue doing what it's doing. Recent reporting has made it clear that the big American banks, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, have managed to increase their lending into the fossil fuel industry 30% in the last 3 years since the signing of the Paris Climate Accord. There are people today outside the headquarters of Liberty Mutual on Berkeley Street in Boston protesting because not only are they investing huge sums, people's premium dollars in fossil fuels, they're literally underwriting the pipelines and LNG terminals and things that allow the ongoing expansion of this work. That's why people have joined together in these movements to try and take on that financial power. The best example of that are the big divestment movements that have arisen. We started work on this 6 years ago. We're now at the point where it's become the largest campaign of its kind in history. Endowments and portfolios worth about $11 trillion have begun to divest from fossil fuel. And the oil companies, Shell, in their annual report this year, described it as a material risk to its business. Why do I bring that up here particularly? Well, Brigham and Women's is an affiliate of Harvard, which is not one of the places that has managed to divest from fossil fuel. Harvard is still trying to make money off the destruction of the planet, which is why there were students took over the field at halftime of the Harvard-Yale game a couple of weeks ago. It was powerful and profound to see that. It's powerful and profound for alumni of those institutions to know that now recent graduates are mounting slates of candidates to try and change the composition of the Board of Overseers. But this is precisely what Howard said about trusted voices in the community. This is precisely what we mean. I'll just finish by saying, the planet is way outside its comfort zone at this point. Way, way outside. I mean, we're seeing concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere that we haven't seen since long before the beginning of human evolution, okay? The planet's outside its comfort zone, so we need to be way outside ours. It is not fair nor rational that people who are already working hard, doing good work like doctors, should also be called upon to engage in this kind of work. In a rational world, we would have heeded the advice of scientists 3 decades ago and gone to work. But since we haven't done that, it is now incumbent upon people who care about other people and about the future to be deeply engaged in that work. And I thank you very much for taking your part in it. Thank you, Howard.
Given the time, I think rather than have a conversation, Bill and Howie show, let's just invite. Thank you. So let's invite comments and questions from members of the audience. And if you'll identify yourself and then ask your question or comment, that would be great. Sir.
I'm Lachlan Farr. I'm from BI. As Howie knows, Albert Schweitzer was one hero. Rachel Carson dedicated Silent Spring to him, so there are themes from that. But Schweitzer said, example is not the main thing in influencing others, it's the only thing. And I'm wondering if you can talk about examples of academic medical centers or medical schools or others that we should be trying to be more like here at Beth Israel, the Brigham. Just like, what are the best examples that we actually need to have more of like us?
So there are very good examples both here in the U.S. and across the world, Lachlan. Kaiser is an industry leader here in the U.S. The Gunderson Clinic is a very strong example. And Healthcare Without Harm, which is a terrific organization, is a repository of exactly these examples. Globally, in other countries where they actually have healthcare systems, as opposed to our country that has a healthcare non-system, there are nationwide organized efforts. The National Health Service in the UK, where I've been living, is a great example. This is a health system that has a Sustainable Development Unit, an SDU, and that is actually thinking hard about every aspect of healthcare delivery, from supply chain issues, where the embedded energy represents a lot of the footprint, all the way to innovative methods of delivering care, what they're calling non-place-based healthcare delivery. So all of us, when we think of healthcare delivery, think of a facility, a place where people go and do their thing. Providers provide and patients receive care. But if we can obviate the need for travel, essentially reimagining telemedicine in the context of green health care delivery, we may be able to deliver better, less expensive, and lower carbon footprint healthcare. So good examples of systems, good examples of innovative practices and innovative thoughts from around the world.
And on this more meta level of trying to challenge and change the politics and economics, there are some good examples that have emerged. Professional medical societies around the planet have divested their fossil fuel holdings the UC system, across its system, a month ago divested its $80 billion pension and endowment from fossil fuel. That's a very big deal. It sends very strong signals into the market and helps enormously. So that kind of work is, of course, magnified precisely by the trust that people put in physicians and scientists and researchers. And it's been remarkable to watch how scientists have begun to put that to work. The March for Science that happened 2 years ago was really the first instance of large-scale engagement of bench scientists, physicians, and others in this kind of political challenge. And the attention that it drew was enormous and very, very helpful.
Hi, I'm Jennings from Northeastern University student. This question is for Dr. Frumkin. So you mentioned like innovation and technology as some reason to be hopeful, like for electric cars, but I've heard that like the manufacturing of cars itself and the sale of new cars is the most polluting part of the process or the life cycle of a car. Like 50% of the carbon emissions of a car comes from its manufacturing. And because of all this innovation, we're driving sales of cars up, which is actually worse for our environment. Especially for electric cars, the manufacturing involves mining of rare earth metals. And we know that it's common for companies to market their products as eco-friendly, whereas they're actually not. Like recently, Starbucks got rid of plastic straws, but to make up for that, they have different lid design that actually uses more plastic. So how can we hold both producers of goods and also consumers of goods accountable for this change?
You're sure you want that question to be for me and not for Bill? It's the way to do it is to do exactly what you did, which is to interrogate rigorously every proposed intervention to be sure we're optimizing both the social and the environmental and the economic aspects. So I think you're right. We need to think hard about electric vehicles. The best solution is getting people walking and cycling because that's good for health, it's good for air quality, and it's got a lower footprint. So that's great. That has all kinds of implications for urban design, neighborhood design, and so on. Then we need to push transit. And pushing transit and getting people out of vehicles has all kinds of implications for the transportation bill, for municipal spending, for federal spending, and so on. Then when it comes to vehicles, I think you're exactly right that you can do it right or you can do it wrong. Electric vehicles are terrific if you're in Washington State, my home state, where over 90% of the electricity comes from hydro. Not so good if you're in a state where the electricity comes from coal-fired power plants. So the answer to any complex question tends to be, it depends. And you're right that we can do it better or we can do it worse. We need the research and we need the careful accountability so that we do it as well as we can. Billy, I'm sure you've got some thoughts on this.
That was a good answer. Look, one of the useful things about being in a crisis of this scale is it does allow you, maybe even force you to think somewhat more systemically than you're used to thinking. And so it really is, it's impressive to see all the work that's going on with high technology, and it really, an electric car is better than an internal combustion engine car for a variety of reasons, and they're getting better all the time. But it's even more impressive to go to, say, Copenhagen and watch 50% of people commuting by bicycle because they've figured out how to make a city where that's easy and possible. And it's really impressive to go there in January and watch that same 50% of people continue to commute by bicycle through the snow and slush. The world is going to need to change. It's going to change in profound ways, and we'd be smart to try and figure out how to make those changes as congenial to all the sort of challenges that we face as possible. Clearly, and we could talk about this at some length, one of the things that's made health outcomes so difficult in our world in recent years is the rampant economic inequality that we have allowed to flourish, and the data on this is profound. Well, the work that we're doing to try and deal with the physical emergency that climate change now presents should be done in such a way, too, that it helps cure some of that, and it could, just to give the most obvious example, the single biggest players in our political system in the last couple of years, the last couple of decades, have been the Koch brothers, who have their power because they're oil and gas barons. They spent more money on the last elections round than the Republican National Committee and the Democratic National Committee combined. That's why we have policy outcomes across a large array of them. A world that runs on sun and wind will be a different world in a lot of ways, more localized and more democratic, and that's a good thing to hope for as we move in those directions.
Hi, my name's Leanne Canty, and I'm a primary care physician. And Dr. Frumpkin, you spoke about the role of physicians counseling their patients in talking about this emergency. I think a lot of us feel a tension because we feel that we shouldn't be espousing our personal or political views when we're in a room talking to a patient. But on the other hand, we feel that it's such an important issue. So I was just wondering how you might approach that if you were speaking with a patient.
It's a great question, and I think we all need to have a lot of sensitivity to the dynamics within the doctor-patient relationship. The one observation I'd offer is that if you were considering a health threat such as toxigenic E. coli, you would feel relatively free to discuss it with a patient. It would be within scope because it's clearly a health issue and it's not very political. There's nobody who's in favor of toxigenic E. coli. But due to a grave historic accident, we've overlaid political ideology on what is a very clear set of scientific realities and health realities in this country. Climate change is intrinsically no more political, or the effects of climate change on health are intrinsically no more political than the effects of toxigenic E. coli. To the extent that we allow it to become a taboo topic and fall prey to the ideological overlay, we're depriving ourselves of the chance to advocate for health. So I think depoliticizing it, talking about the topic in the most straightforward, medically informed way possible, helps to make it feel a little more in scope within the context of the doctor-patient relationship. Now, that said, I would never prescribe that everybody should advocate behavioral changes of the sort we need or system changes of the sort we need in the clinical setting, because you need to earn and maintain patient trust, and you'll be the judge in each patient encounter as to how best to do that. But I would say that it's not as out of scope as it seems if we remember that it's not intrinsically a political topic. It's been made a political topic by those who have a vested interest in resisting change.
For New Englanders, I'll just add, one of the easiest ways for people to understand and think about this, and one thing that's on an enormous number of people's minds already, is the spread of Lyme disease, which is a classic link. I mean, it's incredibly easy to watch the spread of ticks as temperature rises. And it really is in the front of it's one of those things that's changing our relationship with the world around us. People's fear about letting their kids walk through the woods or go into a field or something is a profound source of sadness and change for a lot of people, and a good way just to kind of meet people on a very easy ground.
I guess the last thing I'll say, it kind of goes back to Lachlan's comment about examples. Even if you feel that it would be out of scope or preachy or invasive to talk about climate change in the context of the doctor-patient relationship, if you quietly set an example, that says a lot. So in the same way that doctors need to be physically active and set an example for patients, and you can do that quietly, but visibly, I think we can do the same thing with our behavioral choices, our institutional choices regarding climate change.
Bike rack in front of the office, yeah.
So wear your bike shoes into the office. Other comments or questions? I know some people have patient care and other things to get to, so please feel free to slip out if you need to. Yes.
So just on that last topic, which I think is actually really important because I'm sorry. I'm Ann Chaley. I'm a general internist. Thanks. is the way I framed the question, the way I framed the discussion with my patients is to mostly focus on what's more healthy. And I don't mention that it's healthier for the planet. I just mentioned that it's healthier. And sort of, I talk about healthier proteins and a healthier lifestyle and reducing using the car less and all those kinds of things. And so I think that's sort of the example I think that I hope I lead. And then I also hope that I talk to my patients about. So anyway, that's the way I framed it. I try to keep it. I mean, I'm sad it's political, but I don't know how you feel about that. If you have some suggestions or key phrases.
Bravo. There's a hand down here. We're providing a lot of physical activity opportunity for the medical community.
Hi, I'm Nora Osman. I'm a primary care physician here also. When I was a med student, we had a patient who had to have her leg cut open to have revascularization because she was a smoker. And afterwards, we said to her, you need to quit smoking because this is directly related to that. And she said, I don't believe you, and I'm not going to. And I think about her a lot when I think about climate change and climate change denial. We can scream and yell and say, this is an emergency, and people will still not believe us. So we were talking about using the medical space as a political arena, and I often think about our skills and strategies as physicians and how we can use those in the political arena. And one of the things that we try to be good at is behavior change and motivational interviewing and harm reduction. And so I wonder, when we are faced with people who just don't want to have the conversation or just don't believe us, yelling, this is an emergency, people walk away. So how do we take some of our diagnostic and therapeutic skills as clinicians and apply those in the political arena? And I hope that makes sense.
So, actually, this season around Thanksgiving and Christmas is a good time to think about this. Don't ruin family occasions by arguing with your crazy uncle. If you'd spent the last 30 years marinating in Rush Limbaugh, this is how you would think too. And, it's hard to get around it. Don't worry about that. Spend the time talking to your sweet aunt and who's already concerned about this and converting her into actually taking action on some of these things. The interesting thing one thing to say is, we all have roles in the world that we fulfill 9 to 5, or in the case of doctors, often, 7 to 7 or whatever. But those are really important. That's a large part of what we do. But we also have our role as citizens outside of our work. Much of the work of saving the world gets done on nights and weekends, and physicians can show up there in powerful ways just by their fact of their profession, but it doesn't have to be the only way in which they intervene. We're all citizens of countries, of planets, but also of, in this case, of university community and so on and so forth, where we can make a difference. And the good news is, and this is a way to keep from getting completely saddened about the prospects for change, you do not actually need everybody engaged in this fight. The political science evidence is pretty clear that if you can get 4 or 5% of people engaged in a fight, you usually win it. And that's because apathy cuts both ways. It's your enemy, but also your ally. We spent an immense amount of time organizing to make sure that we had 7 million people in the streets in September. You have to figure out how many toilets you need and, what the stage is going to look like and the sound system in 1,000 different places. The one thing we didn't worry about was that the next day, 7 million people would materialize to demand more fossil fuels and, extra climate change and whatever. So don't worry that it's an impossible task because there are recalcitrant people. The evidence Howie showed was that 70% now or so of Americans understand the problem that we face in some degree or another. The question is activating some percent of that 70% so that they're able to change the politics and economics of this question. The only thing that's me being optimistic. The thing that makes it hard is precisely the other thing we were saying. In this case, it has to happen fast. So solutions that help us in 2050 or 2070 aren't actually solutions. Climate change is the case where winning slowly is just a different way of losing. So we need very much to have a kind of sense of urgency over the next decade, which seems to be our kind of remaining window of actual leverage.
And just a couple further thoughts. That's brilliant. I love the story of your patient. It's kind of a reminder of what we've learned from behavioral economics and cognitive psychology in recent years, which is that we are very highly imperfect, irrational thinkers as a species. We form frameworks and paradigms and heuristics. We stick with them no matter what. If somebody presents us with countervailing evidence, we don't change the way we think. We discount and insult the source. In a post-fact era where social media are so common, that's a worse problem than ever. That's the challenge. The good news is we actually know a lot about how to communicate. My friend Ed Maybach, who's a wonderful communicator, says, simple, clear messages repeated often from a variety of trusted sources. There you have social marketing 101. Simple, clear messages repeated often from a variety of trusted sources, and that helps move opinions. Secondly, numbers numb and stories stick. Numbers numb, that's why they're called numbers. You know, walkers walk and talkers talk and numbers numb, that's what they do. But stories stick. So the story of your patient will stick in the minds of everybody here. And it may be that instead of saying to a patient like that, the evidence shows that you'll have resolution of your vascular obstruction if you quit smoking, you might say, I had a patient just like you a couple of years ago, and she quit smoking, and you know what? Her arteries got better. So it may be that different ways of presenting information, different methods of persuasion can be more effective. And the last thing to say is that our behavior doesn't always reflect our knowledge and attitudes. Sometimes people do the right things for completely different reasons than you might think. And where do you think the greatest amount of installed wind capacity in this country is? It's in Texas, not in Massachusetts or Washington. It's in Texas. And that's not because they necessarily are climate change crusaders or the vanguard. It's because it made good sense for reasons known only to them. So it may be that there are good reasons for a patient to quit smoking, for people to change their climate-related behavior that doesn't at all depend on believing in climate change or believing in the Green New Deal. So thinking about alternative pathways to the behavioral and policy outcomes we need is probably worthwhile also.
Thank you for your great presentation. I'm Joel Katz. I'm also a primary care doctor, and I want to ask you guys about a separate conversation, a different conversation, your advice on how to initiate that. Let's say, hypothetically, you work at a medical school that's just accepted a 9-figure gift from a oligarch that might have gotten a significant portion of that money from fossil fuel. And by accepting that gift, you are opening up enormous research possibilities for your institution, and at the same time legitimizing perhaps the business and the world that's coming from, hypothetically. And I don't know all the details. That's a different conversation. How do you have, what do you do about that conversation?
I'm guessing this is not an entirely hypothetical situation that we're addressing here, and I don't know the specifics of it and what to say. I do know that the one thing you should not let it do is prevent you from being politically and economically engaged as an institution. Divesting from fossil fuel is crucial. So is putting pressure on the banks and insurance companies that are driving this now. And those are big, live, active campaigns. It really only makes sense, doing things out of sort of honor and principle and whatever is great and important, but things really only ramify and matter if they're parts of existing campaigns that go beyond sort of where you are. So my advice would be to find out, the divestment campaign is a powerful one, and so is the one taking on banks and insurance companies and asset managers. Make sure that if your institution is necessarily implicated in some ways, it necessarily unimplicates itself in others. It's all the more argument for something like divestment, which is very, very crucial part of this fight right now.
Nothing to add.
So if I might just quickly piggyback on that and use this as an opportunity to make a pitch. So my name is Bernie Jones. I'm a newly minted Vice President of Public Policy here at the Brigham, in large measure to build architectures and campaigns around important social and cultural issues like these. So one, I'd like to advocate that particularly you as physicians, clinicians, nurses are our most powerful voices on issues like this. A bureaucrat like me can sit in front of a legislature and make this case till I'm blue in the face and they won't particularly listen to me. But if you don a white coat, all of a sudden you're a completely transformed person in front of them. So we're building cadres of clinicians to meet with our legislative leaders to try and make compelling cases like these, particularly when they're a public health issue. So one, if you'd like to be a part of that, please track me down. And then secondly, we're trying to build an architecture to use the bully pulpit that the Brigham affords, a $4.5 billion bully pulpit, to move issues like this that aren't directly, obviously tied to clinical care. So again, happy to participate and lead these efforts, but thankful to see a room filled with people who care about these sorts of things.
Thank you.
Thank you. And at this time, we are going to have to stop. I think our speakers are going to stay out there for a little while, and then they're going to move to another room. Bernie, we're having this after 9 o'clock meeting for people who can stay. Can you stay? All right, thank you, Bernie. And anyone else who could stay, thank you, everyone, for coming today. Thank you.